There is a story the self-help world tells about healing. It is a comfortable story. It says that healing transforms you into something softer, something more open, something that radiates a quality of gentle, unconditional acceptance toward everyone who crosses your path. That the fully healed person is more patient, more forgiving, more willing to extend grace to the people who hurt them, to the systems that failed them, to the dynamics that nearly consumed them. That healing, in other words, makes you more of what you already were before the pain arrived.
Only better at it, only more refined in your capacity to absorb, to forgive, to remain open. Carl Jung spent decades in clinical practice watching what actually happens when a person does the genuine work of psychological integration. And what he documented bears almost no resemblance to that story. The fully integrated person is not more accessible.
They are not more forgiving in the way that story means forgiveness. The kind that reopens doors that needed to stay closed, that extends trust that has not been earned, that prioritizes others' comfort over its own hard-won clarity. They are not softer. They are something the comfortable story never prepared anyone for. They are precise, sovereign, operationally immune to the specific forms of psychological manipulation that once controlled them completely. And that immunity, quiet, total, requiring no announcement or performance, dismantles entire systems of social control that depended on their unconscious participation. This is the truth Jung documented, not the comfortable version, the real one. And this video is about what that truth actually looks like, not as philosophy, as lived experience. To understand what the healed empath becomes, you have to understand with precision what they were before the healing began. Not the surface version, the sensitive person, the good listener, the one who always understood. The psychological architecture underneath that surface. What Jung observed in his most sensitive patients was a nervous system that had been shaped, through early and repeated necessity, into something that functioned without the filters most people take for granted. Where the average person experiences the emotional atmosphere of an environment from behind a permeable but present boundary, registering what others feel while maintaining some degree of separation between that registration and their own inner state, the empath had no such boundary. Or rather, they had one once. And it had been systematically dismantled by the conditions of their early environment. Because in the environments that produced this pattern, environments where emotional attunement was not a luxury but a survival requirement, the child who could read the room accurately had a meaningful advantage. The child who could sense a parent's mood before it became dangerous had more time to prepare. The child who could anticipate what was needed and provide it before the demand became volatile had more safety. The child who made themselves useful through their sensitivity, who became the one who understood, who mediated, who absorbed and processed, and transmuted the emotional difficulty of the people around them, had secured a form of belonging that might otherwise have been unavailable. The sensitivity was not simply innate, it was trained. Refined through thousands of interactions in which accurate reading of the room produced safety and inaccurate reading produced consequences. Deepened through the years of a childhood organized around the emotional management of others. And gradually, over time, it became so thoroughly woven into the structure of the self that the empath could no longer distinguish where their own emotional experience ended and where the absorbed experience of everyone around them began. Their inner world had become, in significant part, a reflection of others' inner worlds. A sophisticated psychological instrument pointed entirely outward, with almost no capacity remaining for internal calibration. Jung called this state psychic porosity, maximum perception, zero protection, complete self-abandonment disguised, with genuine sincerity, as compassion. What the empath constructed on top of this porosity was an identity. And it was an identity built, at its foundation, on a premise so deeply embedded that most empaths never consciously examined it. The premise that their worth was measured by their capacity to absorb what others could not. That their purpose was to metabolize other people's pain. That their sensitivity was not something they possessed but something they owed, a debt to be paid continuously, to anyone who recognized it and reached for it. From this premise, the entire structure of the empath's social life was organized. They became the family therapist before they were old enough to understand what therapy was. The friend who always understood, who never needed anything in return, who was available at any hour for any crisis. The partner who could hold space for anything, for rage, for grief, for the particular kind of difficulty that other people had found intolerable and brought, reliably, to the one person they knew would not turn away. And with each role they accepted, each function they performed, each piece of themselves they set aside to make more room for someone else's experience, they buried themselves deeper under layers of borrowed suffering. They said yes, when every cell in their body was screaming no. They stayed when every instinct they possessed was pointing toward the door. They smiled through their own quiet disintegration, because the alternative, acknowledging what the role was costing them, would have required a confrontation with a truth their entire identity was organized around not seeing. That much of what they called love was a system, a deeply conditioned, largely unconscious arrangement in which their sensitivity was the resource and the people around them were the beneficiaries. And the arrangement was not reciprocal, had never been designed to be reciprocal, because reciprocity would have required the other parties to bring the same quality of attention to the empath's inner life that the empath brought, automatically and without being asked, to theirs. And that quality of attention was precisely what most of the people in the empath's life had never developed, because the empath had made it unnecessary by always being there, always absorbing, always managing the emotional weather before it could become a storm that anyone else would have to navigate. Jung noticed something in these patients that their social circles consistently failed to see. Beneath the continuous performance of availability, beneath the smiles and the understanding and the seemingly inexhaustible capacity for care, something was accumulating. Not gradually diminishing energy, not simple fatigue, something more specific and more volatile. The empath's unconscious was keeping records, with a precision that their conscious mind had refused to apply. Every manipulation registered, every betrayal catalogued, every moment someone reached for their sensitivity, not because they valued it but because it was convenient and available and had never cost them anything to access. The conscious mind rationalized each entry. They are just stressed. They did not mean it. That is simply how they are. I understand why they did it, but the unconscious recorded it without the rationalization, without the mercy the empath's conscious self could not stop extending. And the accumulation built, silently, invisibly. With the specific pressure of something that has no release valve in a sealed container, until something created one. And that something, in case after case across Jung's clinical observations, was betrayal. Not the ordinary disappointment of discovering someone was imperfect. Not the manageable hurt of a friendship that had grown apart. Betrayal. From the specific person the empath had protected most thoroughly, the one they had made the most room for, extended the most grace toward, chosen, repeatedly and consciously, to believe in despite the signals that their own deep perception had been sending them for a very long time. The discovery, when it came, always had two components. The first was the external fact of the betrayal itself. The second, and this was the one Jung found psychologically more significant, was the recognition that the empath had known, not consciously, not in a form they could have articulated or acted on at the time, but known. Their perception, the same finely calibrated instrument that had been reading emotional atmospheres accurately since childhood, had been registering the truth all along. The inconsistencies, the moments when what was being presented and what was actually happening did not quite align. The recurring, quickly suppressed sense that something beneath the surface was not what it appeared to be. And the empath had silenced every signal. Not from weakness. From the very mechanism that made them who they were. The desperate, deeply conditioned need to see the best in people, to project onto them the goodness that the empath could sense, somewhere beneath everything that contradicted it, was theoretically possible. To love the potential rather than the reality. To keep the story alive rather than face what the evidence was clearly indicating. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. The empath had been projecting, had been seeing not who people were, but who the empath needed them to be, for the sacrifice to feel meaningful. And when the projection finally collapsed, when reality arrived in a form too undeniable to absorb and rationalize and transform into something more tolerable, what fell away was not just the illusion about this specific person. It was the entire architecture of projected goodness on which the empath's emotional world had been constructed. What happened in the immediate aftermath of that collapse was what Jung found most clinically remarkable, and most consistently misread by the people who witnessed it. The empath did not break down. They did not enter the extended grief that the people around them anticipated and, in some cases, prepared to manage.
They did not explode in the anger that the situation objectively warranted. Instead, something descended that looked, from the outside, like calm, but was not calm exactly. It was something more final than calm, a quality of stillness that settled into the way the empath held themselves, the way they spoke, the way they moved through the rooms of their life. As though a decision had been reached. Not consciously deliberated, not arrived at through argument or analysis, simply completed. The way a process that has been running underground for years finally surfaces, not as a crisis, but as a conclusion. The people around the empath found this more disturbing than tears would have been. More unsettling than the anger they had been bracing for, because it communicated something they did not have language for yet. That the person they were looking at had seen something, and was not going to unsee it. And was not going to pretend, for anyone's comfort, that they had not seen it.
Jung described what was happening at the level of deep psychology as the beginning of shadow integration. Every empath carries a shadow, the rejected dimension of themselves that their conditioning had taught them was incompatible with being who they were. The part that is selfish in the most fundamental sense of the word, that prioritizes its own needs without requiring external permission, that can assess a situation with ruthless accuracy, and act on that assessment without spending weeks managing the guilt, that can recognize manipulation clearly and simply not engage with it rather than absorbing it and attempting to transform it, that can see someone drowning and understand, with clear-eyed compassion, that jumping in is not always the right response. This shadow had not been evil, it had been the empath's psychological immune system. The part of them designed, at the deepest structural level, to protect their integrity, their energy, their inner life from being indefinitely consumed by the dysfunction of others. It had been suppressed so completely, for so long, that the empath had genuinely ceased to believe it existed in them. Had internalized the cultural narrative that their sensitivity obligated endless giving, that their capacity for care meant they had no right to the limits that protected it. The betrayal broke that narrative open. And in the breaking, the shadow finally had space to rise. Not as an explosion, as a homecoming. The part of the empath that could feel everything, finally meeting the part that could choose what to do with what it felt. And in that meeting, quiet, unremarkable, requiring no announcement, something was completed that had been interrupted a very long time ago. The integration of the shadow does not produce what most people expect. They expect relief. The specific relief of someone who has finally put down a weight they have been carrying so long they forgot it was there. And there is something like relief in it. But what arrives alongside it, and what quickly becomes more significant than the relief, is something that has no comfortable name in the language most people use to talk about psychological healing. Precision. A quality of perception that had always been present in the empath, but had been functioning, until now, without the structure needed to make it genuinely useful. Because before the integration, the empath's extraordinary perceptual capacity had been operating in service of a single, continuous project. The project of absorbing, managing, and transforming the emotional content of everyone around them. Every signal they registered, every microexpression, every vocal shift, every moment of behavioral inconsistency that contradicted the presented surface, was immediately converted into input for that project. What does this person need? How is this dynamic moving? What can I do to bring this towards something more stable? The perception was real. The acuity was genuine. But it was entirely directed outward, toward others' experience, toward the management of other states, toward the continuous, exhausting project of holding together systems that were not the empath's responsibility to hold. After the integration, the same perception remains fully intact, but its orientation changes. For the first time, it is pointed, at least partially, inward. And what the empath discovers when they turn that instrument on themselves, with the same quality of clear-eyed attention they had been giving to everyone around them for decades, is both illuminating and disorienting. Because they find a person they had not been properly introduced to,
Someone with genuine preferences, genuine limits, genuine reactions that had not been processed through the filter of how they would land on everyone else before being allowed to exist.
Someone who had been there all along, waiting with the patience of something that had learned there was no point in demanding attention it was not going to receive.
Jung identified 3 distinct stages in the transformation from fragmented sensitivity to integrated psychological sovereignty. Each one builds on the previous, each one requires the abandonment of another comfortable illusion about who the empath was supposed to be. The first stage is the cessation of absorption.
This sounds straightforward. It is not. Because absorption was not a behavior the empath chose. It was a structural feature of how their psyche was organized. A default setting so thoroughly established that it operated below the level of conscious decision entirely. Someone expressed distress in the empath's presence, and the absorption happened before any choice was made about whether to absorb. The distress was simply inside the empath before they had registered that it arrived.
What the first stage of integration produces is not the ability to choose not to absorb,
at least not immediately. It is the ability to notice, for the first time with any consistency, that absorption is occurring. To register, in real time, the moment when something that originated in another person's psychological state has crossed the boundary and entered the empath's own experience. And in that noticing, in the gap between the moment the content arrives and the moment the empath would previously have already been deep into the project of managing it, something becomes possible that was not possible before. The question of whether to engage, not the answer yet, just the question. For someone who has spent decades without access to that question, its arrival is significant. Jung called this conscious differentiation, the developing capacity to observe emotional content without automatically internalizing it. To register someone's projection, their rage, their guilt, their need, and recognize it as theirs, rather than immediately treating it as material the empath is responsible for processing. In practice, this creates a quality that the people around the empath experience as profoundly disorienting. Because the empath is no longer providing the expected response. The guilt trip is deployed with the precision of long familiarity, aimed at exactly the vulnerability that has worked before, and lands in empty space, not because the empath has stopped feeling, because they are no longer standing in the target zone. The emotional content returns to its source. The person deploying the manipulation is left holding what they were attempting to transfer, and most people cannot tolerate this. They escalate. They accuse the empath of coldness, of having changed, of no longer being the person they used to be. They are correct. The person they used to know was organized around unconscious absorption. That person is gone. What stands in their place is someone who can feel everything that person felt, and choose, for the first time, what to do with what they feel. The second stage is selectivity, and this is the stage that most thoroughly dismantles the comfortable story about what healing looks like. Because the healed empath does not become more universally available. They become less available. Precisely, deliberately, without apology, less available. Not to everyone, but to the specific category of people and dynamics that had previously consumed the majority of their energy. The people operating from unconsciousness, from the unexamined assumption that the empath's sensitivity was a resource existing for their benefit, available on demand, with no cost that mattered. The dynamics built on the implicit arrangement that the empath would continue absorbing, the other party would continue producing material to be absorbed, and the arrangement would be sustained through the empath's consistent willingness to prioritize the relationship's surface harmony over their own integrity. To these people, to these dynamics, the healed empath becomes effectively inaccessible, not hostile, not cold in the way that coldness is usually understood, as the withdrawal of feeling. Simply unavailable. The way a door that was previously always open is now simply closed. Not locked. Not barricaded. Not defended. Closed. And not going to be opened for the specific purpose it was previously opened for. Jung described this selectivity not as the construction of walls, but as the development of a threshold. A threshold with conditions. Conditions that are not explained, not negotiated, not softened to make them more comfortable for the people who encounter them. Simply present. And this distinction, between nice and kind, between conflict avoidance and genuine clarity, becomes the operational center of how the healed empath moves through their social world. Nice is the management of others' comfort at the expense of your own truth. Kind is the willingness to be clear, even when clarity creates discomfort, because you respect both yourself and the other person enough to engage with what is actually true rather than what is convenient. The healed empath stops being nice. They become kind in ways that most people, habituated to the previous version, experience initially as harshness. Kind enough to allow someone to face consequences, rather than absorbing those consequences on their behalf. Kind enough to say no without constructing an elaborate justification designed to make the no more palatable. Kind enough to end a relationship that exists only through continuous self-abandonment, rather than maintaining it indefinitely in service of the other person's comfort. Kind enough to be honest when honesty is more useful than the performance of acceptance. The third stage is the one Jung found most remarkable and most sobering, because by this point in the integration, the empath has developed something that extends well beyond personal psychological health. They have become, through the specific combination of their innate perceptual capacity and the decades of forced immersion in human psychological complexity, genuinely predictive. Consider what had actually been happening during all those years of absorption. Every emotional atmosphere registered was data. Every behavioral pattern logged was pattern recognition being developed. Every moment of sensing someone's intent before they acted on it was a predictive model of human behavior being refined through continuous real-world testing. The unhealed empath collected all of this data and then systematically discounted it, second-guessed their assessments, overrode their internal warning systems, told themselves they were being judgmental when their perception was simply being accurate, chose the story over the evidence because the evidence was too uncomfortable to act on. The healed empath does none of this. They trust the database completely. When every system within them signals something, deception, manipulation, the specific quality of interaction that precedes exploitation, they do not wait for external confirmation. They do not require proof in the form others would recognize. They already know, and they act accordingly, not reactively, not with drama or accusation, simply by not being where the thing is heading, by making the quiet, efficient decision to remove themselves from the trajectory of something they can see clearly enough to know they do not want to be present for its conclusion. This is what Jung meant when he described the healed empath as operationally dangerous to anyone who mistakes their awareness for availability. Not dangerous in the sense of threat, dangerous in the sense of being genuinely immune to the specific mechanics of manipulation that had previously worked on them without exception. Because the manipulation mechanics depend, at their core, on being able to introduce content into the target's psychological system without the target noticing the introduction. On the target absorbing the projection, internalizing the guilt, accepting the framing, before they have had the chance to recognize what is happening. The healed empath notices what is happening. In the first moments of an interaction, before anything has had the chance to take root. And, noticing it, from a place of integrated sovereignty rather than defended anxiety, they simply do not engage. Jung spent considerable time analyzing a question that the empath's transformation raised with particular force. The healed empath understands the mechanics of psychological manipulation at a level most people never reach. They have not just read about it, they have lived inside it, from the position of its primary target, for years. They understand which vulnerabilities to approach and how, which fears to activate and when, which wounds to apply pressure to for maximum effect. They have, in other words, the complete blueprint. The question Jung was analyzing was not whether they could deploy this knowledge destructively. They could, with an efficiency that would be genuinely unsettling to witness. The question was why, in case after case, they chose not to. His conclusion was not that they lacked the capacity, it was that they had developed something more sophisticated than tactical skill, something that emerged, not despite the years of suffering, but through them. Integrity. Not as an abstract value, as a lived, daily, operational choice. The choice to use their understanding of human psychology for protection rather than domination, for clarity rather than control. For the quiet, efficient maintenance of their own sovereignty rather than the exercise of power over others. Jung believed this was the most mature expression of individuation he had documented, not the integration of the shadow in the sense of becoming capable of darkness, but the integration in the sense of becoming capable of darkness and choosing, consciously and continuously, not to deploy it. The capacity held in full awareness and set aside every day
in favor of something that required more discipline and produced less immediate satisfaction, but pointed towards something the empath had always, beneath all the conditioning, actually valued. A life built on what was real. What the healed empath's presence does to the social environments they inhabit is worth describing carefully. Because it operates without any deliberate intention on the empath's part, it is simply the natural effect of a person who has integrated their shadow, moving through a world where most people have not. People operating from genuine authenticity, who are not performing a version of themselves designed to extract something from the interaction, feel, in the healed empath's presence, something they rarely encounter elsewhere. The specific ease of being seen clearly by someone who has no investment in what they find, who is not managing their own impression while simultaneously assessing yours, who brings to the interaction a quality of full presence that most social exchange, organized as it is around mutual impression management, never quite achieves. These people move closer. Because genuine presence, when encountered, is recognized, even when it cannot be named. But people operating from inauthenticity, from the performance of a self constructed to secure something, or from the mechanics of manipulation that had previously found in this person an inexhaustible resource, encounter something entirely different. A quality of perception that sees through the performance without comment. A presence that does not provide the expected responses. That does not supply the validation the approach was designed to produce. That does not absorb the projection, does not accept the frame, does not take up the role being offered. And most move away from this, not dramatically, by simply discovering that the interaction does not yield what they came for, and directing themselves elsewhere. The healed empath does not need to actively manage their social world. Their integrated presence does it for them, naturally, continuously, without effort or drama. The people who remain are the ones who can meet them at the level they now inhabit. And that is a far smaller group than what preceded the transformation. But it is real, in a way that almost nothing in the empath's previous social life was real. There is something Jung observed in the healed empath that he described as perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire transformation, not the sovereignty, not the precision, not the immunity to manipulation. Something quieter than all of those. The healed empath becomes, for the first time in their life, genuinely at rest inside their own experience. Not peaceful in the performed sense, the performance of peace that the unhealed empath had often maintained for the comfort of the people around them while quietly suffocating beneath it. Actually at rest. In the sense of no longer being in continuous motion, the perpetual motion of absorption, management, transmission, return. The empath who spent decades as the emotional center of every system they inhabited suddenly has access to a stillness they do not know what to do with at first. Because stillness had always been the enemy. Stillness meant there was nothing to manage, no crisis to absorb, no one who needed them in this specific moment. And in the absence of needing to be needed, the old identity had no content. But in the integration, something different becomes possible in that stillness. The empath's own inner life. Thoughts that belong to them, and not to the project of managing someone else's experience. Feelings that arise from their own genuine responses to their own genuine existence, rather than from the continuous absorption of other states. Desires, preferences, reactions, the ordinary furniture of a person's interior life, that have been crowded out for so long that their return feels almost foreign, almost too quiet to trust, but real, unmistakably, finally, theirs. Jung said that what the empath discovers at the end of this journey is not something new, it is something recovered. The recognition of a truth that was present before the conditioning began, before the environment taught them that their sensitivity was a debt, before the repeated reinforcement of the role taught them that their worth lived in their usefulness to others, before the accumulated years of self-abandonment disguised as love, created a self so thoroughly organized around others' experience that its own experience had become effectively inaccessible. The truth recovered is simple. Almost embarrassingly simple, given the complexity and cost of the journey required to return to it. Their sensitivity was never owed to anyone. It is theirs.
A capacity that arose from within them, that belongs to them, that can be directed by them, toward the people and purposes and moments they genuinely choose.
Not distributed automatically, not offered as the price of belonging, not converted into function for the benefit of whoever recognized it and reached for it. Simply theirs. To give when giving is genuine. To withhold when withholding is honest.
To direct with the same intentionality they now bring to everything else in a life that has become, slowly and at considerable cost, actually theirs. This is what a healed empath really becomes. Not the comfortable version. Not the story the self-help world tells about returning to innocence, about becoming more open, about radiating unconditional acceptance toward everyone regardless of what they bring. Something more honest than that, and more powerful. A person who can feel everything and choose. If something in this reached a place that recognition comes from rather than argument, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have finally stopped absorbing. Because naming what you are putting down is the first act of keeping it down.